Welcome back to the Carolina Weather Group, continuing an amazing series here on location in Chester County, South Carolina at the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety, where they are making exactly that, our businesses and homes more safe by doing real-world experiments. Hopefully you were with us last week when we saw incredible real-world experiments happening right here at the lab. They set a home on fire, a manufactured home just made for this experiment to understand fire spread, to help communities developing across the country be safer against wildfire season. And we went inside their hail lab where they are testing and studying hail to understand its impacts to your home, to your roof, to those shingles, how to best protect yourself. It's tips and advice coming right here out of South Carolina. James Brierton back here at IBHS. We've got Jared Smith, Tim Pounds, Dan Whitaker, Candace Jordan, a collection of our Carolina Weather Group family together in person as we are continuing to recount some of the memories from our first 500 shows. We're going to pick up right now with our conversation about some of our most memorable guests. I would like to start, if I may, and it happened during the weather telethon we did with our podcast friends. Jared and Tim, I know you guys will remember this, but there was a point in that day where we were scheduled to talk to Jim Cantori, Mike Bettis, and Ken Graham, the first two from the Weather Channel, the latter being the director of the National Weather Service. It was an hour of the telethon that was being produced and organized by our friends at Weather Brains, but it was still being all produced through the Carolina Weather Group and through just magic. Three of those guys, the big trifecta names in the weather community, ended up on the show at the same time. And I remember just sitting there. Tim was in the room with me, and I was like, don't touch anything. I do not want this to get disconnected. Do you remember that, Tim?
Oh, yeah. Man, and that was such a fun day, too. And, of course, I was in the background, right in the green room and waiting for folks to go on air and everything. But, I mean, just to see all these people and even ask them some questions was just incredible. Yeah, that telethon, definitely one of my favorite highlights of CWG.
Jared, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, and let's think about just how much good we did with that too.
Yeah.
And us Stormfront freaks, Chaser Chat, just the whole amalgamation of the weather podcast community coming together to raise thousands of dollars for the American Red Cross. So, it was a really cool chat for an excellent cause.
Yes, and Stormfront Freaks were the ones who suggested it, and they decided to do it all together and not just go at it alone, which I think's to the camaraderie of the weather community. James Spann was there. His show, Weather Brains, is the oldest of the weather podcasts. I jokingly call him the godfather of weather podcasts, but he's also one of the biggest names we've had on our show.
Yep.
I think you were there, Jared, when he came on to talk about, and Dan will correct me, the April 27th, 2011 tornado outbreak, and that experience that he shared was just an incredible story.
Yeah, that's a man who was changed by that, and you can't fake that. Spann is a living legend amongst us weather nerds, and you could tell that was a day that is etched into his memory. It was very powerful to hear him tell his story there and the lessons that he learned and things like that. And from that day, we've learned a lot. And we have, heck, even in our own storm coverage, I've tried to incorporate some of the lessons that he had from that day. And it was that was just cool to talk to him, and get to understand, kind of where his head's at. I still don't understand how he only sleeps 4 hours a day. I wish I could do that and be functional, but
I could not. No, I know that for a fact. And you talk about his advice. He was telling us that the best way to communicate weather hazards is to give landmarks. It's near the Waffle House, it's near the Dollar General, which is, I think, one of the assets that we try to invoke into our Carolina Weather Group coverage, because we're all spread out across the Carolinas. We all have an idea of what our own communities are like.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've seen that in some of your coverage. I also think that knowledge and that trust has led people to nicknaming you Weather Daddy.
That did happen. They call me Weather Daddy at Starbucks now. So
wait, they're writing it on your cups?
They're writing it on my cups sometimes, yeah. So.
That's amazing. That's official.
That's official. That's it. But for anybody who's not familiar, I saw it during our Debbie coverage.
Yeah.
I don't know if it predates that or not, but you were doing tornado coverage during Tropical Storm Debbie, and the comment section just decided to start referring to you as Weather Daddy.
Yeah, I don't know. And the funniest part is he's the daddy. I'd be, they started calling him Weather Uncle.
Yeah, they kind of got it backwards.
Yeah, they got it backwards. It's like, but yeah, it was, I'll tell you, it was really good to, that was fun. That was a moment of levity that I think was needed because it was a serious situation. It was a nocturnal tornado threat. And, we were trying to do everything we can to keep people informed. And it sounds like we helped a lot of people that day. And I'm just eternally grateful for everybody who watched and shared. And that it was just really good to be part of.
Dan, we've had chasers and non-chasers alike tell their stories on the Carolina Weather Group. You've shared your own. Any guests that stick out in your mind when you think about first 500 episodes?
I just got to say, a lot of the guests we had have just been fascinating hearing the stories. Overall, I mean, honestly, every time we have a guest on, I learn something new. If any that stick out, of course, James Spann, Jim Cantori, Brett Adair. Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything I've been involved with has been an interesting story. And that's, I think, why we do what we do, because everybody has a story, and we're all involved with weather and storms, and, whether we like it or not. So here we are.
Candace, what about for you?
I think mine's going to be a little more hyper local than, the national stars like, Jim Cantori, but Brad Panovich.
We know him well.
Yes, we know him super well, but, he's such an integral part of the Carolinas, especially, over towards like Piedmont area. But, just having him on and his expertise, and he's got a great way of communicating science for the average person, which I think is really huge. So yeah, he would be one of mine.
And he's been so generous with his time with this show, predating, I think, all of us on the panel, going back to the early days with Scotty and Ricky Matthews, when this show was streaming as a Google chat, because Brad was one of those very first broadcast meteorologists to step up and contribute, and there's so many others across. Hopefully we've had a chance to introduce you to your favorite broadcast meteorologists through having them on the show. Panovich is certainly a good example. Tim Buckley in Greensboro. I'm suddenly drawing a blank.
Rob Fowler in Charleston. I mean, I remember when we were doing, it was unbelievable for me, growing up with those guys, watching them on TV, to then be on Carolina Weather Group with them as we were analyzing impending tropical weather. We would bring them together in the panel. Walsh would be at home petting his dog. Rob Fowler would be in the, he'd be in the studio, and it was just really, those are the kinds of things that I've absolutely loved.
It's like a common ground. It doesn't matter who you work for. This is a safe space to come together. And we look at Scotty Powell, who's on TV in Myrtle Beach up against Ed Piotrowski.
Yeah.
I'll just say, one of the coolest parts too is you get to be a weather nerd with other weather nerds. That's kind of outside of your local sphere that you normally run in. So that's kind of fun. You get the collaboration part. And then there's also parts where I'm fangirling, and I'm like trying to hold it in, and I'm like, okay, act smart, act intelligent, say the right things. Like, you're with these notable people, You're
like, how did I get here? Or maybe that's just me. Yeah. You talk about the fandoms, and I think they are interests and loves that we share with the audience at home too. And we hope that we're the conduit for you between your love and so introducing you to. Outside of weather, we always joke there's a Venn diagram overlap between space, and I'll come back to trains in a minute. But, we had a huge opportunity last year. I went down to Kennedy Space Center. We got a lot of behind the scenes content. Jared, Candace, you guys were integral, along with our own Peter, in producing live coverage of the Crew-6 launch?
Yeah, that sounds right.
It was 6, right? From Kennedy Space Center. But Candace, space for us has also kind of been a shared love with our audience.
I feel like weather and space are very connected. One, I joke when I'm at work at the museum, I always talk about I'm a weather and space enthusiast. I'm looking up. It's just how far up do I want to look that day? But they're very connected, and we've done a lot here on the Carolina Weather Group. We talked about the OSIRIS-REx mission. Artemis missions, and we'll probably continue to talk about those.
I hope so.
Yes, Artemis 2 soon. We've talked about the Perseverance rover and the little PAL Ingenuity, the helicopter that went along with it. The Orion spacecraft, SpaceX. So there's been a lot that we've incorporated with those rocket launches, those notable like NASA missions.
Yeah.
And we've even talked about like the GOES missions, like I think GOES-U, and that there directly impacts weather because it's a weather satellite. And so kind of bringing in those astronomy and meteorology elements.
To have the opportunity to speak to those program leads for NOAA's GOES satellite program has been an incredible opportunity. That's been one of those pinch me kind of moments. We were just talking with Evan Fisher, who was on our show for a while. He's now off doing his fall foliage thing over at Explore Fall, and he was just telling us about 2 weeks ago on this show how he's using those satellites to track fall colors. Huge shout out, of course, to Tony Rice, our Raleigh-based NASA ambassador, and all the knowledge he's. But Dan, that brings me to another particular memory, which was when we had a rocket launch. It was a sounding rocket out of NASA Wallops, which is in Virginia, but it was perfectly positioned for so many of us here in the Carolinas to see it, and you got to see that rocket shoot across the sky and do its sounding experiments, if I recall. What was that like for you out on the Outer Banks?
So that was quite an experience. I mean, being out there in Rodanthe of the Outer Banks, and probably one of the darkest places in North Carolina and on the East Coast, it's considered a star viewing kind of hot spot. To be able to see that rocket launch in all of its glory, unobstructed by city lights, was beautiful. To see all the colors and to be also able to film it with a telephoto lens and get kind of close-up shots of all of the happenings with the rocket. It was just unreal.
I remember that night. It was, I think, the last launch attempt. We had gone so many scrub launches, and we were all so anxious to see it. And it was the one night, if I recall, that you were able to get out to the Outer Banks.
It sure did. Yeah, using a telephoto lens, I mean, I was cropped in tight, just enough to get the rocket trail kind of fully covering the video, and tried to stay with it as it kept on going up into the sky. And in a lot of ways felt fortunate, as well as just cool to see it in person.
Yeah. Jared, one of the other things that I think about when I think about the things that we cover that are weather adjacent as much as they can be is that Chinese spy balloon.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And what a just unusual day that was.
That was incredible. I mean, I loved, the thing that I love about that is that we always try to tie back to our core subject, and it was actually tailor-made for weather people.
Upper level winds.
It was it's like you're looking at the upper air charts trying to figure out where is this thing going to go, and so
and it was Evan who first tipped us off because he was up at home in Asheville.
Yeah, he saw it,
and I woke up that morning, and on CNN is Evan's photo of the balloon now spotted over the Carolinas, and I went, "This is gonna be a long day."
And then they closed the airspace over Charleston.
They did.
And so there I was. It was like, all right, I'm going to the beach. Now keep in mind it's January. Okay. so there I am. I'm going to the beach and I'm trying to see this thing. I can't see it. But then Scotty's also out there. And then Scotty's phone dies or is close to dying. And then he's like, and then he comes back in and is like, I think they got it.
Yeah, Scotty was out there on the beach. You guys had both just darted off to the beach hoping that one of you would be in position. And Scotty happened to be in Myrtle Beach. Yeah. And you're right. He was trying to use whatever battery he had left. We were watching fighter jets circle around. Yeah. And then all of a sudden he goes audio only. But what we hear is him go, it's gone. It's gone. Yep. Yep. And I thought I knew what he meant. It's just like, what's gone, Scotty? And he was like, the balloon. And I was like, that's what I thought. That's what I thought you meant.
It was a real privilege to see the F-22's first air-to-air kill on the Carolina Weather Group.
Got to update our mission statement after that. Tim, you've produced our panelist playlist series, which people can find on Spotify, listening to their favorite songs from their favorite panelists. It was a really cool opportunity to get to know the group a little bit better. And we got to know you and I a little bit better when we did one of those off-color episodes, and we went to go check out trains in Pennsylvania about a year or so ago. But I also have to say it's the episode that we probably got the most engagement on. And I felt like this was a good trivia moment of what thing have we taken the most flack for. And it wasn't for our coverage of trains. I think we managed to muster that up just fine. Right. But there is one shot and I don't even know if you remember it, but you and I were driving through Altoona. We were downtown, and we were trying to navigate wherever it was we were going to, and I was just shooting video and also trying to navigate. And I was just shooting video of locomotives parked, but apparently one of them was Norfolk Southern's 1801, which is a very important heritage unit, represents a lot. The rail fans, that is a particular Norfolk Southern unit you look for. Neither one of us batted an eye at it, and it just ends up in a random cut in the video where we're doing other narration towards something else, and the comments are just like, way to pay no attention to NS 1801, and I'm like, I'm sorry. We were lost. I was just shooting video.
There was so much to see. So much to see. We didn't get it. That's okay.
So our apologies, and I'll also say that I'm still learning Norfolk Southern rail fan things to spot, because so much of what I look for is CSX, and I live near old Seaboard tracks, and hopefully soon going to catch the new Seaboard Heritage locomotive. But Tim, do you remember how hot and how smoky it was on that trip?
Hot, smoky, and we were dodging the rain and the fog. I mean, it was a pretty intense trip, but getting to stand there at Horseshoe Curve, though, and watch trains, 3 or 4 of them circling you on all sides, was a pretty memorable experience.
So if you're a rail fan stumbling across this episode for the first time, you're in good company. Welcome. Altoona, Pennsylvania, a great surprise opportunity that we got to take the show on the road. Being here in Chester County, a great opportunity in our home turf. Some of the amazing places we've been. Dan, I think you've been our tour guide to many of them. Storm chasing.
Yes. Yeah, I took the show on the road earlier this year out to Texas, and we had a table out at the Storm Chaser convention out in Texas, the National Storm Chaser Summit. Hopefully we'll continue just streaming wherever I end up, wherever the storms are. Hopefully that's where I'll be.
Candace mentioned Brad Panovich earlier. One of the distinct memories I have with Jared and Dan, and I don't remember which storm it was, but we did a joint stream with WCNC, and it was Brad Panovich and Brittany Van Voorhees anchoring. I was in the control room, but you were in Charleston, and you were out in the field kind of doing this joint storm coverage. I don't even remember if you remember kind of standing out on the dock in Charleston. It was late at night, and I was just like, yeah, this is what it's all about.
I think that was Ian.
Was that Ian?
I think that was Ian, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Ian, I started at the coast of Florida, and then I ended up coming back around to Charleston and then up to Myrtle Beach, I think, for a double intercept on that one. So, yeah, I was with Ian for that point in time. A few days, probably looked a little bit ratty, but
they must just all blur together after a while.
Especially when you...
Not to diminish the impacts in the communities, but when you are driving that much and going from one impacted community to the next.
Yeah, and it so appears that the last few good Florida big intercepts that have occurred, the big hurricanes that have hit, tend to swing across Florida, come up and re-hit around Myrtle Beach. So it seems that I keep getting them twice. And unfortunately for the people in between there, because there's massive flooding effects when that tends to happen. But it definitely starts to blend together a little bit.
Our first ever remote show, if I recall, was in our own backyard, Candace, when you reached out to us to invite us to the Shield Museum for weatherproof in
2018. I know. We just did our 6th Carolina weather group at the Shield Museum this year. It's at our weatherproof event, and getting to spread meteorological knowledge, meeting meteorologists, just getting that to the community and letting them see that there's more than just what you see for 2 minutes on TV. Like, there's a whole side of meteorology that you don't get to see, and these are the key people who are storm chasing, who are issuing warnings, who are saving property, like we are here at IBHS.
Jared, we have burned the midnight oil from Fred to Florence, Ian, Isaias. Which storms stick out in your mind when you think about the coverage that we've done?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there's Isaias, definitely the one that was most interesting pronunciation-wise.
I think a lot of people struggled with that.
Yeah,
I think we still do.
But we nailed it. No, Carolina Weather Group nailed it. We're very good at that.
There was one particular elected official who wishes he didn't attempt to say it.
Yes, that is correct. But I mean, Isaias wasn't really too crazy for us. But I mean, when I think about the storms that we had, some of the scariest moments that we've had, honestly, were not direct hits from tropical cyclones. They've been tropical tornadoes. So Elsa, Debbie, we just did that a few weeks ago. I mean, there's been Fred. Fred spawned numerous tornado warnings. Ida, we were on air. You were in Virginia. I was back in my studio, and we were on air covering tornado warnings in New York City.
That was a really weird, and we'll explain that one in a moment. But Candace, you were just looking at some of our most popular YouTube videos. Those Canton flooding ones, I think, made the list.
Yeah, the one that we had the flooding in Canton, and that was from Fred.
Yes.
So lots of tropical induced things, even way inland.
I mean, we were just talking. It's the F names and the I names, Dan, that seem to really make the list.
Good to know.
Yeah, when you're planning your storm chases.
That's where I'll be.
Ida was one. We were supposed to have an off week. I was going on a trip. I had booked myself. This will be a reoccurring theme, but I think loyal viewers know I like trains. So I had booked myself one of those bedrooms on an Amtrak train, and we ended up storm chasing on an Amtrak train, which is not what you want to do because you cannot divert. And we were plowing through polygons that had confirmed tornadoes in them. I was listening to the radio coming through the Washington, D.C. market going, I wish I could get off this train. And then I finally got off, and you were navigating me through the flooded streets of Pennsylvania from Charleston.
Yes, I
was.
was.
And then I finally got to my hotel. We were in a flash flood emergency in Pennsylvania. I was like, this is not the trip I had planned. No. And I was like, I guess we're doing the show from here tonight.
Yeah. James is in the parking lot. And I'm in the studio after navigating him around a bunch of flash flood warnings. I was very impressed, honestly, that we could get him there. That was a minor miracle in and of itself.
My friends who were getting married are also very appreciative.
I'm sure. I'm glad we could help. But it was that was a wild day. I mean, and Ida was a wild storm. I mean, you had. What was the funniest part about Ida was that it just took a break in parts of the Carolinas. Ida really wasn't a problem for the Carolinas.
It had left the Carolinas, and I kind of went with it. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in a flooded parking lot, and you're in my ear saying, "We've got a tornado warning for the George Washington Bridge." And I was like, "What is happening?"
Yeah. That was something I never thought I would say on the Carolina Weather Group. But what was interesting too about going back to Ida. It was so bad. I remember we were planning coverage for it because it was like, wow, this could be a significant tornado threat, and I think they had a slight risk out for us associated with Ida. Now the problem is slight risk is usually a bust. It's always got to be marginals.
It's the strangest thing.
In the Carolinas.
Yeah.
No magic.
That's right. I love the SBC, but when it's marginal, I go, oh yeah, we got to go. When it's only a level 1, 2 or 3, don't worry about it.
I think the Carolinas are where high risks go to die. Which is great. I'm not saying that.
Didn't we have a Helicity design T-shirt at one point from Shay Gibson?
It was
where fronts go to die.
Where fronts go to die. Yep. Yep.
Hit up our merch store. we burned a lot of gas getting here today. Let's talk about Florence though, because Florence was another one of those. I was traveling. Side note, I guess pay attention when James is traveling. I had flown out of the Carolinas, so I was in a hotel room in New York, joining you guys for coverage, which I think worked a little well because we were having sporadic power outages across the Carolinas. But that was one of those storms where I remember I was due to fly back, and I got on the phone with American Airlines and I said, I'm not coming back. And they hadn't yet canceled flights for Charlotte. And they said, sir, your flight's still a go. And I was like, no, you do not understand. I'm not flying back into the aftermath of Florence. And sure enough, don't yell at customer service people. That's not the takeaway here. But I'm glad I stood my ground because by the end of the day, there was no power. My neighborhood was flooded, and I was like, I'm glad I didn't fly back. But Florence was another one of those that I think easily tops the top 5 storms we've covered.
Oh yeah. I mean, just for water alone.
Yeah.
I mean, forget wind, forget any of that. I mean, it was that water was the story, and that was just devastating for the PD area, Conway, Horry County, Florence County, places like that. It was bad. I think there's no other way to put it. I mean, it was extremely nasty, and there's been a couple scares since then.
I've been thinking like Florence, Matthew.
Oh, Matthew was awful.
Matthew was
terrible.
Really bad. And I feel badly for, in particular, like that Horry County area, because I think it was during these storms where we first connected on our show with the Horry County Rising Group. They just came back on after Debbie because they deal with all of that river flooding, because all of us inland, when we get rain, it flows down out to the coast. Dan, you've done storm chasing down in those areas, and I think you were out there for Debbie. You followed Debbie from when it came ashore in Florida back up through the Carolinas. What was some of that flooding like?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, compared to those other storms, Debbie had its moments for sure where a lot of rain came in, but I was driving through looking for flooding in the exact same areas I was at in Florence and in Matthew. At one point in Matthew, I was stuck on a hill for, I think, 9 hours, and I went through that same area, and the rivers hadn't risen to a level in some of those areas where I'd seen them previously in these other historic storms. But still, there was definitely some isolated spots where some flooding was going on. The wind damage was a lot less when it made landfall. So overall, just a less impactful storm from my side. But like you said, seeing those same areas impacted over and over and over again. It was Florence. It was Matthew. It was, I could probably name a half a dozen other ones. But
yeah, and I can even picture in our own montage Chris Jackson nearly getting stuck in Cherry Grove for one of those storms at night, right? One of those very flood-prone areas. Candace, earlier this year, you and your colleague from the Shield Museum did an episode on spring gardening, which touched upon climate change and how spring gardening was starting earlier because of changing climate. That also yielded lots of YouTube comments about climate change. They were all very lovely. Thank you so much for writing in. But I'm thinking now, as we're having this conversation about flooding and excessive rainfall events, I think Jared's right. Wind is wind, but the rain and the water and how that ties into a repeated trend.
Yeah, and you're thinking about all this housing's going up, right? Like you're seeing, developments popping up left and right. That's more concrete. That's more surfaces that can't absorb the water. So when we're getting these events, and they tend to be, inland where we get a lot of that rain, it flows downhill. Rain and water is our biggest issue, I think.
Yeah, and I feel for the folks in the Carolinas, and it's a 2-state initiative where you can get flooding in the mountains, you can get flooding in the Piedmont, and then it's got to flow down and double up, triple up, quadruple up with all the rain that the coastal areas like Charleston have already experienced. Like you guys flood on a sunny day.
Yeah, we do.
You don't need our help.
We flooded the morning of this recording, so there you go. We really don't need a big help. But when I think of river flooding, I think of 2015, and that predates my time in the Carolina Weather Group. But 2015. The thousand-year flood that we just eclipsed a few weeks ago in some spots with Debbie, that really was extraordinarily impactful. Up in Columbia all the way down. There's places flooded for days. So when Debbie came around, and we had Debbie was actually departing, and then there was another round of rain right behind it that hit 8 inches of rain in 3 hours. And we saw the rivers go up. We saw the rivers go up to levels that eclipsed 2015. That's the thing that blew my mind with Debbie. And I think, we had a lot of people asking, and it's like, my place was fine during the 2015 flood, but it was like, no, that's great. But all of the woods are gone.
Right. Exactly. Like I'm saying, there's so much popping up now. And I don't think the consideration all the time is, where does the water go? And so now you're starting to get even more record-breaking type flooding.
Yeah, you look at these lists of record-breaking storms, record-breaking floods, and so many of these 1,000-year floods are all condensed to the last 5-10 years because the timelines are almost becoming more and more compacted. Candace, talking about climate, I can't help but notice the lack of snow. It was 2021, I think, where I last stood outside in snow in my driveway 3 weekends in a row on the channel. We were chasing what was snow, what was wintry mix. I know the kids got to play, but we haven't had any snow, at least in the Charlotte area, the past 2 years. I feel like in other parts of the Carolinas, we've been in a real snow drought.
Right. If you go through and look at all the kind of different things we've covered here on the Carolina Weather Group, it's a lot of tornado, wind damage, water damage, but we don't get to do a whole lot of snow here. And I feel like, you talk to people and they're like, back in my day, back in the childhood, I remember this blizzard, I remember this. And it's I feel like even now I'm getting older, I'm doing that. I'm I remember when it used to snow. It's we haven't had that as much anymore.
Our own Frank Strait grew up in Rock Hill. I think he's got something to add here.
So I'm kind of in the same boat that y'all are. It's like I think back to, when I was a kid, it snowed all the time. Back in the 70s and 80s, and it did. We would get 2 or 3 snow events each year. That being said, we never really had any of these doozy type snowstorms back then that we've had in the 21st century here in South Carolina, with the exception of the 1973 snowstorm. I was 1 year old for that one, so I don't remember that one. But that certainly was a doozy of a snowstorm in my lifetime, with that being South Carolina's biggest snowstorm, dropping 24 inches in Reminisce. And I'll just pass it back to you now, James.
Tim, you are a producer for us. You made our panelist playlist, but you were in Georgia for, was it Michael?
Yeah, it was for Michael and I believe one other storm. A lot of these storms y'all are referencing always seem to either come across Florida and skirt the coastal Georgia line before hitting Carolina. I was living in that coastal Georgia area, Brunswick, Savannah, during that time. And even though it never really came on shore there, we saw a lot of the effects of it. And a lot of that area is pretty different demographics, different financial levels, can be kind of a poor area, which of course means manufactured housing, some other stuff like that. I mean, it could get pretty rough pretty quick down there.
Jared, I don't want to forget 2020, a year so many people won't forget, obviously because of the pandemic, the Atlantic hurricane season running out of names, but the spring severe weather season kicked off hot April 13th, 2020.
We were about 3 or 4 weeks in, and COVID concerns were at probably a fever pitch. They were at a fever pitch at that point. Everyone was distancing. Everyone was gone. And so that was a very challenging event because we had to tell people now to take shelter in an enclosed location.
The communication aspect got really tricky, right? It was, everyone was saying practice social distancing for good reason. And then it was, if you need to evacuate and go to a shelter, then forget the social distancing thing for a minute and tornado trumps COVID.
Yep,
It was tricky. It was tricky. What an incredible opportunity we have had here at IBHS for these 2 episodes. If you're a new viewer, we encourage you to go back and check out our YouTube archive, and hopefully you'll find some things you love in there. And most notably, we couldn't do this show without you. We would just be talking to ourselves if you weren't here. So each and every week when you show up for our weather podcast, each and every week when you show up at those odd hours of night to join Weather Daddy for live severe weather coverage, we appreciate you being there and you trusting us to bring that coverage to you. We bring it as often as we can. So many of us have other day jobs, but we do this because we love it, and we love it even more that you're loving it. So thank you to you at home. And we're looking forward to the next 500. We're taking your ideas for episode 1000. Where should we go next?
The moon.
That's what I was going to say.
By episode 1000, we might be going to the moon.
Yeah, we'll start the fundraising now. It might be possible.
We'll just hitch a ride on Artemis 4.
Perfect. Special thanks again to everyone here at IBHS for letting us come out and be in their hair for a day and see what it is that they do to help make all of our lives a little bit safer. We appreciate them very, very much. On behalf of Tim and Jared and Dan and Candace and everyone at the Carolina Weather Group, I'm James Brierton. Stay subscribed. We'll see you back here again real soon for more episodes of the Carolina Weather Group.
Yeah, that needs to be a after the credits roll, like a hidden scene.